The Apple Watch Series 10 is here. It has the biggest display ever. It's also the thinnest Apple Watch ever, making it even more comfortable on your wrist, whether you're running, swimming, or sleeping. And it's the fastest charging Apple Watch, getting you 8 hours of charge in just 15 minutes. The Apple Watch Series 10. Available for the first time in glossy jet black aluminum. Compared to previous generations, iPhone XS or later required. Charge time and actual results will vary.
Hello and welcome to Gabfest Reads for the month of January. I'm Emily Bazelon, one of the co-hosts of Slate's Political Gabfest. I am here today to talk about the new novel, The Safekeep, with its author, Yael van der Wouden. Hi, Yael. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emily. Such an honor to be here.
When I read The Safekeep, all I knew about it pretty much was that a good friend of mine and my sister recommended it, and it had been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. But I didn't know a single thing about the book, and I actually loved entering it that way. This is a book that has a kind of haunting at the center of it. And so we're going to talk about the whole book, but I really recommend that listeners read this book before listening to this entire conversation, because I did really thrill to the feelings of discovery I had as I was going through the narrative. And I think, Yael, you very carefully and deliberately kind of constructed the book to have a kind of mystery at the center of it. So let's start, so we don't spoil the whole mystery up top, by talking about the setting you chose, which is the Netherlands in 1961. Why did you pick that book for this, your very successful debut novel?
It's so good to hear that that's how it ended up on your desk, because that was my creative self. I was just hoping that that the book would be given to somebody, just that's how it would be passed on. Somebody telling you, don't read anything about this, just dive into it. And I was also hoping that I could sort of sneakily sort of get to some readers that otherwise would not have read the book. I've heard several stories of women leaving the books lying around at home and their husbands picking the book up and being like, oh, I wonder what this is. And then entirely sort of being immersed in it. And that was not the demographic I ever imagined that I would have, the dad demographic. And I'm incredibly happy to have the dad demographic. But yes, the reason why the 1960s is, it's twofold. On the one hand, I wanted to investigate this post-war period where it feels like everything should have, that the war has been left behind, that everything is, the society is moving on, people are moving on. It's the early 60s. We all have our own associations with the 60s. And then to enter it through a character who in no way, shape, or form embodies the 60s, because there's no excess, there's no happiness, there's no liberation in Isabel's life. She's very much restrained and contained to her own home. So I wanted to start the novel at a moment where you expect freedom and then don't find freedom. And then on the other hand, for reasons we cannot give away, for plot reasons, it needed to be exactly that period of time for everybody to be at exactly the right age.
Right. And I also thought, this is a kind of post-war European setting. And one thing that comes across really clearly in Isabel's mind, because you're in the close third person for much of the book, is that she had a really intense experience of the war. As a Dutch citizen, she had to move from Amsterdam. Her family feels like it endured a certain amount of suffering. And I thought a lot about how deprivation during wartime happens in degrees, but that if the major part of the population experiences some degree of it, it can make them only kind of see that internally. And I felt like the narrative sort of unfolded. She's talking to other people in the small town she lives in, and people are quite still thinking about, a time of rationing, a time of war. And I wondered if that was something that you did some research into, or maybe when you lived in the Netherlands, that was something that was still present in your experience.
Still living in the Netherlands. I just moved to Rotterdam, so still very much here. it was on the one hand something I did a lot of research into. Once I knew for certain that it was going to be set where it was and in the 60s. And on the other hand, it's not something that you can avoid very much if you live here for longer periods. If you speak to people who have not just lived through the war, their children, grandchildren, the hunger winter is a huge element in Dutch culture. It looms over everything. It looms over the culture in the smallest of ways. When I was a child here, I would sometimes, when I would go play at somebody's home, and this is, I have to say, this happened in the east of the country. Whenever I tell this story, people from the west and the south get really offended. They're like, "We are not like that." But all the same, what would happen is that the family would gather for dinner, and then I would be asked to wait outside in the hallway while they were having dinner. At the beginning of the week, we buy our groceries for exactly the amount of people that we know are going to eat with us, and there's only that many potatoes, that many pieces of meat, and there's no space for anybody to join. And also, it's not correct to feed anyone else's child. And whenever you ask people about this part of Dutch culture, the answer is always the hunger winter. This is because of the hunger winter. Now, I have my question marks with this. I think plenty of societies and cultures have experienced hunger without ending up with this version of cultural identity. But it is in the way that the Dutch relate to food, to being very careful and very mindful of their possessions. All of that is always returned back to that period, during the last leg of the war. And so I've heard so many stories from neighbors, from older people, but also from people from grandchildren who pass on their parents' stories of this period of time. And it was interesting to me. Sort of, I started doing research, and I really found myself digging more into the anecdotes than I did the hard research, at least for this part of the story. For the other element, I had to lean primarily on research.
I'm glad you brought up possessions, because another thing that is really central to the narrative is, so Isabel is living alone in a house that she grew up in with her two brothers and her mother. Her brothers have more or less moved away. Her mother has died. And she is very concerned about the house itself, which is basically a character in the book, a kind of looming presence. And then the very specific set of possessions that her mother has left behind. So the number of spoons and particular sets of dishes and other things in the house. And it was interesting. Part of her oddity is how much she's absorbed in these possessions, and it seems not exactly materialistic, but kind of obsessive. And then there's a turn in the book, and you start to understand the possessions in a different way. And I was wondering, how much you were sort of thinking about all of that, and whether you were making whether you were thinking about the materiality of the possessions or their representation of this history that is part of the book.
This is the problem when talking about this book. It turns into riddles when you can't give it away. It turns into so much of a riddle that I'm forced to ask. Could you?
Well, I think at this point we should talk about the history in the book.
Okay.
We've lured
so if anybody hasn't, if anybody hasn't read it, they don't want to sort of find out the third act of the book, which is a twist, then switch off now and return later.
Excellent spoiler alert. That was perfect.
Well, the premise, first of all, is that Isabel lives in this house, has only her possessions and her control of the house to sort of lead her through every single day. And then one day, her estranged brother, Louis, shows up with his new girlfriend, Eva, with the news that Eva is to stay for the summer. Isabel's obsession with materialistic order sort of shifts toward Eva, and Eva becomes the object of obsession. Why is Eva here? What does she want? Is she stealing things? Because things start to disappear from the house: a spoon, an oven dish, a knife. We have, on the one hand, an obsession that turns into a love affair between the two women. And then on the other hand, with the third twist, we have the revelation that the reason that Eva is there, and the reason why she basically mastermind her coming to the house is because the house was her family's possession. Ava is Jewish. Her parents were both taken to the camps. Her father passed away. Her mother came back, but passed away briefly after that. And when they returned, they found their house lived in by other people, and that is Ava's and Isabel's family. And the deed of the house had been transferred to Isabel's family, as happened with a lot of houses of Jewish families, and with a lot of just material goods of Jewish families. They were kept by the people who were supposed to keep them safe, hence the title. And then we have Isabel also finding this out slowly through by way of a diary. So to answer your question, right, about how I thought about Isabel's relationship to things in light of this history, and also knowing that all these things were going to be revealed as not truly belonging to her. It seemed like a perfect way to slowly unravel a character like Isabel, whose entire modus operandi is just control and order. And there's so little that she can control in life. She's, the way I described her, is not badly socialized. She has not been socialized enough. Right, she's not been taken out to the park quite enough in her childhood. She has no friends. She has no hobbies. She has no lovers. She barely knows what love is. She sees it as a terrible bad thing that only comes for you when it means to hurt you. And so she controls the only thing that she can control, which are the things in her house, where they go, and to which degree she can keep the house neat and in order. Anybody who comes in and disrupts this order and this cleanliness stands in her way of maintaining her control over the world. And up until the moment that Ava arrives, any kind of disruption of control only comes from her maid, who can't do anything right in her eyes. She always does something wrong. She also always suspects the maids of stealing things from her. And then Ava comes along and is the worst version of any maid and the worst version of any house guest. She touches everything. She stays where she shouldn't in Isabel's mother's bedroom. She has wine with the maid, the wine that came from the cellar. And Isabel finds in this loss of control. I put all these things into place for Isabel, not just for her to then find out that all of her control revolves around somebody else's possession, but also to find out that her own relationship to possession is there to keep a deep well of desire in place. And once Ava has pushed enough buttons, that well of desire spills over, and that's where we get the romance. And so ideally you start reading the novel thinking that the things and possessions represent sexual repression and represent control in one certain way, and then when you get to the end of the book, you see that it has more facets to it.
This episode of Gabfest Reads is brought to you by GiveWell. GiveWell is a nonprofit that researches and recommends giving opportunities and is committed to maximizing the impact of donations. Each recommendation is grounded in months of rigorous research and transparency to ensure your contribution has the greatest possible impact on the world. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. And rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives. Plus, GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. So you can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And when you make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, GiveWell doesn't take a cut. So go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Gabfest Reads at checkout to make sure they know that we sent you. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. This episode of Gabfest Reads is sponsored by Quince. It's a new year, a new opportunity to reimagine yourself and to reimagine your wardrobe. This year, Resolve to refresh your look and stay on budget. And you can do that thanks to Quince. Quince has cozy Mongolian cashmere sweaters that start at $50. I have a colleague who lives in these sweaters. Literally every time I'm on a call with him, he's like, look at my sweater. It's so comfortable. We were talking about our Quince clothes the other day. I was wearing a performance polo, which is kind of my Quince go-to. I was wearing my forest green Quince performance polo. He was wearing a cashmere sweater. And we were like, oh, this is so comfortable. But however you refresh your look, all Quince pieces are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices, and they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel. So upgrade your closet this year without the upgraded price tag. Go to quince.com/gabfestreads for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/gabfestreads to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/gabfestreads. This episode of Gabfest Reads is sponsored by Discover. Here is a little tip for all you music fans out there. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard right, 99%. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back, which means you could earn rewards for those almost front row seats, ride shares to the venue, even that concert merch you've had your eye on since it dropped. If all of that sounds like music to your ears, remember, it pays to discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/credit card. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, what the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass f- So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Can we talk a little bit about this idea of safekeeping objects? There is another character in the book, an aunt of Isabel's, who is also keeping an oven dish. And she is also really talking a lot about this oven dish and how the person who she thinks gave it to her during the war wants it back. And again, one's understanding of this shifts in the course of the narrative. Is this idea of keeping safe objects from people who went to the concentration camps and the Holocaust, is that something that, how did you come up with that idea?
Oh, that's, again, did not have to dig very far. There's a word within the Dutch Jewish community that was used to refer to people who would keep things safe and then not return them if the people return, because only just a very small fraction of the people who were taken to the camps returned in the Netherlands. But from those who did return, very little of them actually got their things back or their homes back. And so a word was developed, and that word is bewarier, which bewaren in Dutch is to keep something safe. And arier is, I think you can figure it out, it's Aryan. So it's a jokey word. It's used a little bit as a joke, right? The Aryan safekeeper, bewarier. And that is a story that I've heard repeatedly also growing up from friends and family friends. Stories of menorah, stories of homes, but also stories of things that were left behind, and then people just had to basically shoulder their way into somebody's house and physically take their things back. There's a short story in the Netherlands called Het Adres, the address, by this author called Margaminko, and she wrote a short story about exactly this. And for as far as I could find, this was the only piece of fiction that deals with specifically this period, this post-war period, and specifically with people trying to get their things back. And I found myself wanting to read more. I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was it's such a tense dynamic that you then create between people and things. And it's a way to sort of project onto things a far larger issue, which is you did not want me, you sent me away, you wanted me gone, if physically, if not just in every single way. Now I've returned, and now this item represents the repression, the oppression, the marginalization, the hatred. And then the conversation, rather than being about that, becomes about the thing. And I thought that was fascinating. And I was also really interested in seeing if I could take that projection that you hated me, you wanted me gone, you didn't want me here, and turn it into desire and still have it revolve around a physical item.
There is a lot of desire and forbidden love in this book, and a lot of greatly written sex, which is really hard to do. And I congratulate you on that.
Thank you very much.
Why is the central narrative of the book about two women falling in love? How does that fit into these historical themes that you're exploring?
I wish that I could give a more sort of yes, I wanted to, pull this idea of forbidden this into that, forbidden that. But the truth is that I'm queer, and so I wanted to write and see a story about two women, and that's really what was interesting to me. But of course, naturally, it becomes fascinating in the way that other people respond to them, and in the way that they don't respond to them, because they are invisible. The very idea that they could be attracted to each other or love each other doesn't come up. It doesn't. No one seems to even to suspect them of anything, and even not Isabel's gay brother, who believes that she just needs to find the right man, and that anytime that she's nervous or uneasy around men, it's because she's actually, she's just shy and she needs to open up. So there's several ways of being invisible in this book, of being not seen by your environment for who you are.
I think the queer love story accomplishes something else, which is it changes all of the power dynamics, right? It means that Isabel is also vulnerable in this way that made me much more sympathetic to her. Suddenly, all her oddities went from being obsessive and irritating to having a completely different valence in my head. And then also, she and Ava are doing something transgressive, and it changed how I thought about Ava coming into the house as well. So I actually felt it totally makes sense that you would have written it out of experience and wanting to explore themes for that reason. But I think it also is very powerful. I was thinking, if this book was a heterosexual love story, there are all kinds of things that would throw off the power of the story that you're telling and how it fits into this historical episode, right?
Yeah, I think if Isabel was a man, then it would just feel like the natural progression of the story. Of course, right? The sister's girlfriend appears, and that's going to be the love story. But because we have Isabel, who does not even know herself what she wants, does not even recognize desire. She thinks it is, she doesn't understand it until she's sitting on her bed's edge, consuming a pear in its entirety. And to have it be sort of this, I wouldn't say unexpected. I think, certain readers will always or at least look for it between the lines, but at least
it's foreshadowed, I would say. It doesn't come out of totally nowhere.
No, exactly. You see very quickly that Isabel is staring a little bit too hard. But I think there is indeed, that's for me, I was trying to recreate that feeling when I read a book, and I'm like, oh my God, will they? And then they never do, because it's never the main story. And then to just fully commit to the bit and be like, yes, they are going to, it's very freeing. But also, I think it creates a sense of something that is simmering below the surface that Isabel herself does not understand. which at first is her own sexuality, and then it's just history as a whole. I think that wouldn't I wouldn't have been able to achieve that if it was a straight love story. No, then it would have just been like it would have felt far more of an open goal rather than something simmering under the ground coming to get you.
I think that's right. And also, if Ava had been a man, then I think I would have felt like maybe she was taking advantage in some way. It would have changed that part of the story too, and made that character potentially a little bit menacing.
The point of it all is that neither of them own anything. Isabel has this house, but the house is not hers; it's her brother's. She has no property. She's there. She has an allowance, but that's as far as it goes. And to have the both of them want in a world where they are allowed to have so little, I think it's more transgressive than if it had been a different way.
Yeah, agreed. You are also the author of an essay from a few years ago called On Not Reading Anne Frank that was published in the Sun magazine, which I also very much recommend, and is full of your thinking about what it was like to move from a young childhood in Ramat Gan in Israel to the Netherlands and experience being Jewish in these different contexts. To set the scene a little bit more, your mother is Israeli. She has a European background, but I think she's from like Bulgaria and Romania, if I remember correctly. And your dad is Dutch and not Jewish, and they're artists and they met. And so you had this kind of dual upbringing in Israel, and then you moved to the Netherlands. And you're thinking through the kind of lens of the story of Anne Frank and using that to talk about what it was like to be, one of a small number of Jews in the Netherlands. I wonder what it has been like for you right now to publish a piece of post-Holocaust literature. This is a moment in which, what's been happening in Israel-Palestine has been so hard for so many people for lots of reasons, and lots of artists have been caught up in that conflict. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about too. And I wonder, how that affected the reception of the book, and whether it changed at all how you were thinking about how you wanted to talk about these events.
It was very strange to have the book come out around then. My first feeling was, who cares about my book? Who cares about this book about a fiction like this at this moment in time? What has been fascinating is to see the ways that people have read it, and on all ends of the spectrum, and have read it as basically it's. I feel like it's become sort of a story that people can project onto what it is that they want to read into it, which I welcome. As I studied comparative literature. I very much encourage the engaging with text as its own individual thing rather than what the author intended it to be. But it is a book about dispossession, and so it's been very strange to have people read it and not see that I'm also speaking of the dispossession of Palestinians, and I'm also speaking of the violence and genocide on a broader scale. And that's been definitely a process. But also it's given me many really interesting conversations and has brought fantastic people into my life. The thing I always say is that this book could only exist because of my relationship to the idea of victimhood and perpetratorship, in the sense that I don't come from a line of victims in only, or perpetrators only. I always, the way I try to describe it is that colonialism has been the major force that has pushed my family around the world. On the one hand, I have my Dutch grandmother who was born in then Dutch occupied Indonesia, and during the war ended up in a Japanese internment camp. And after that, she moved to the Netherlands, and my other grandmother, my Jewish grandmother, left Vienna, where she was born, in order to go to Palestine. And so I have two grandmothers, one that because of the war was moved out of a colonial system into an internment camp, and another grandmother that fled internment camps into colonialism. And so this question of perpetratorship and victimhood has never been a clear singular line in my family's heritage. And also when you look at Eva and Isabel, I think the easy conclusion is to read it and say, oh, Yael clearly is Eva, and some imaginary Dutch woman is Isabel. But I'm both of them. Also, in who I am, I'm Dutch but Jewish. I have both parts are parts of my heritage, and I wanted to investigate that in this novel.
Yes, I was struck thinking about your book by a line in your essay. You were recounting being in school and another student raised their hand and asked, should we keep remembering the Holocaust? Which I think has been a real present question for a lot of people in lots of directions since October 7th. And your answer to this is we don't have to stop remembering one thing to make room for another. And I actually think this book is like a contribution and a kind of offering to that sense of meaning.
Thank you so much. That was, if there's one great hope for this book, that would be that.
I think that's a great place for us to end. Yael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was wonderful.
Yael van der Wouden is the author of The Safekeep. That's it for this month's edition of Gabfest Reads. Our producer is Cheyna Roth. Ben Richmond is Senior Director of Operations and Podcasts. We'll be back next month with another edition of Gabfest Reads. Until then, all three of us, David and John and I, will be back in your feed on Thursday with a new episode of the Slate Political Gabfest. Thanks so much for listening.